G'day guys, Will here, welcome back to the channel. So today's video, we are getting to work installing all of the components into our ROG Maximus XI Hero motherboard. So CPU, what else have we got here? RAM, our NAND or our SSD drive, our Waterblock, and then we've also got our Surface Preparer and our Arctic Silver 5 thermal paste there as well to install. And then if we have time, we'll also install the motherboard into the case as well. So we're sort of starting to get towards the home stretch now. The only thing really left after that is to install our graphics card, all of our piping, and then test everything out. So let's get to work on the motherboard installation. Okay, so we have here in front of us the Maximus XI Hero, and there are a couple of reasons why I chose this motherboard specifically, primarily because it's going to allow us the ability to overclock to the levels that we want for our 9900K, which we have here. And it's not got any of the bells and whistles that we're not going to need for this dedicated sim racing PC. So it doesn't have Wi-Fi, doesn't have any of those sort of external thingies going on. It's basically just a really good quality motherboard that does everything we need it to do straight out of the box. So the first thing we might do is install the SSD, I think. Now it's going to go in the slot underneath this cover here. There are two slots on this motherboard. The one at the top is for a SATA-based SSD, whereas the one on the bottom here is for a normal SSD drive or a VNAND NVMe M2 drive. So that is where we're going to install it. So we'll start off by undoing the two screws here. We'll lift up the little heatsink and we'll get to work installing our Samsung SSD. Okay, now one thing that you'll notice here is that the SSD has a sticker over the chips, and the little heatsink that sort of bolts down on top of it has this thermal transfer layer here, a thermal pad. Now, a lot of people attempted to try and take the sticker off these. That's not a good idea, first of all, because it does leave a massive mess behind. You really do risk tearing the chips straight away from the PCB, but also because the sticker that the Samsung have put on there is actually thermally conductive as well. So you don't need to worry about taking the sticker off. Obviously, it transfers the heat a little bit better with the sticker removed, but it really hasn't been a problem. I had exactly the same drive in my previous machine, a couple of other machines that I've built as well, and I've never had an issue with temperatures. So what we're going to do now is install it into the motherboard, but we need to install a little standoff in there first. So I'll show you how to do that. We'll get it installed, we'll get the heatsink on, and then we can move on to the CPU. Okay, so it's going to install in the little slot just here. We can see here the standoff is going to end up just there. So we want to make sure we're not screwing the SSD directly down to this part. We want to make sure we install the little standoff that's supplied with the motherboard first. So we screw that into position. We then slot the SSD into the slot. It can only go in one way. Make sure you slide it in like so. And then we just want to push down on the top of it while we insert the screw. We want to make sure we don't get our grubby fingers all over the sticker, because that is going to be our thermal transfer layer there. So put that there, grab the little screw, and screw it down. Not too tight, just finger tight's fine. You really don't need to reef at it. Just tighten it down so it can't move anywhere, and that is cleanly installed. So now we want to remove the protection layer from our heat pad here. This one's actually got a bit of damage there from factory. I don't know if you can see that properly on camera, but a little bit of a missing spot there. It shouldn't matter though. It's only a very small area. And then that's going to sit down exactly the same spot again. And then we reinsert the factory screws that came with the motherboard. So now we want to move on to installing our CPU, but before we actually put the CPU into the slot, we need to do some preparation work. You can see here there's 4 little holes in the back of the motherboard, which we need to install the back plate for our water block, and then the mounting screws will mount on top of that. CPU goes in, and then the clamping down screws will go on top of that once the water block is in place. So next thing we need to do now is unbox our beautiful EK Velocity DRGB water block and have a look at exactly what is included in the package, get the backing plate installed, and then we can get to work installing the CPU. Okay, so here in front of us we have all the components that we're going to need to install the water block on the CPU. So we've got a shim here, or sort of like a gasket, a metal bracket here for securing nuts. Now you'll notice that these don't have any sort of screwdriver hole or anything like that. Everything here is meant to be done up finger tight. You've got the 4 mounting posts for the socket 1151 type, 4 washers as well to protect the motherboard, and then 4 little springs here as well to provide the tension evenly across the entire surface. So what we need to do is remove the motherboard from the box. So this is going to be a little bit awkward to install on camera, but we'll do the best we possibly can. Okay, so we need to remove the motherboard, flip it over, and you can see here we've got 3 little screws here. So those coincide with the cutouts in the bracket. So it's going to sit like that. Now we want to make sure that we have our rubber shim in there first. Now you'll also notice that it has this little insert here. So we want to remove that, and then that's going to sit nicely around the outside like so. So that sits on there. And then the bracket is going to go over the top of that. Like that. So then we're going to flip the board over and install a washer and a thumb screw on each one. So we're going to want to install the CPU not necessarily as quickly as possible, because we want to take our time and not be, you know, reckless or rushing. But we want to make sure we have all the bits and pieces right where we're working beforehand, so that we're not running off trying to find things. We don't want to allow dust and, you know, fingerprints and things like that to get inside any of the components that we're going to be working with. So you're going to want to have some isopropyl alcohol or some surface purifier like what I have here. If you have that available, you're going to want to have your Arctic Silver 5 or whatever thermal paste you want to use. The CPU block actually came with a little tub of thermal grizzly, or a little syringe of thermal grizzly, but I've always used Arctic Silver 5. I find that to be very, very well performing, so that's just sort of like my personal preference. We're going to obviously want the Waterblock itself, which is going to go on. Now you'll notice that I've left that in its package until the very last minute as well, again because I don't want to get any dirt, and of course some little cotton tips or something similar as well to actually clean the surface of the CPU if necessary. So ideally we don't want to touch it, but if we do accidentally get a fingerprint on the surface or something like that, we're absolutely going to want to clean it before we install our thermal grease or anything like that. So we're going to start off by releasing the little catch here to remove the plastic cover, and that simply flips up like that, and the little shim comes off like so, and this exposes the pins for the CPU. So that can get set to the side. We then want to open up the little package for our CPU very carefully. And you'll notice here there's a little key marking. So there's a little arrow on the bottom corner of the CPU just there, which lines up with the cutout just here as well. So the CPU can only actually fit in the motherboard one way. If you get it wrong, it's you're going to have to force things to get it in. So basically it sits in like that, slots into place. Make absolutely sure that it's keyed correctly. There's another little notch there as well as at the top. So you really can't mess this up unless you do something really stupid. So then the little cover goes back down over the top, leaving the latch up. This part slides underneath the bolt here, and then we simply lever it down and into place. So it does require quite a bit of force. And there you go, our CPU is installed. So the next step now is to install our thermal paste. We haven't gotten any fingerprints or anything like that on the top, so we're all good to go. So the next step now is going to be to actually install our water block and our thermal paste. So what we're going to do now is take the water block out of its protective packaging, and there we get our first really nice look at it. It's a beautiful piece of equipment. And we're going to remove the little sticker on the back very last. So we're going to install our thermal compound. We're going to remove the sticker, check that there's no marks or anything on the block itself and that it's perfectly clean. And then we might need to do some purification as well, but hopefully we won't need to. Hopefully it'll be a complete mirror finish. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. Back in the old school, we used to put the thermal paste on and then use a plastic bag or something to spread it out over the surface. I noticed that EK's instructions that come with this water block actually say to put a line across and then spread it across like that. What I like to do is put 2 little dots in the middle, about the size of a grain of rice, and then the CPU block installs completely flat down. Now we need to make sure that we're applying absolutely even pressure when we clamp the block down, otherwise all the thermal grease will sort of squish to one side and it won't do its job properly. So we just take the lid off. And we just squirt 2 little pieces about the size of a grain of rice in the middle. Like so. I might actually do just a little bit more for good measure. Now I'm sure the YouTube comments will explode with, oh, you've used too much or you haven't used enough or whatever. There's always opinions on this sort of thing. I always go with the school of thought that a little bit too much is better than not enough. And then next we take off the surface here, and you can see here that this is absolutely perfectly clean. No issues whatsoever. So I don't think we even need to bother cleaning that. We're more likely to just sort of add extra dirt than we are to actually achieve anything by doing that. So now what we want to do is drop this on completely evenly across the surface, like so. Push it down and the paste will spread out. Then we drop a spring over each one of these, and then we start installing our nuts. So as I said before, we want to go in a cross pattern here. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, and we don't want to tighten them all at the same time. So basically just get it started so it's starting to grab. Get the next one, tighten it a little bit so it's just starting to grab. Next one. Next one. Okay, and then we want to just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and just keep going around in circles like that until the whole thing is completely tight. And there we go, Waterblock is installed. So we're going to want to run the RGB cable somewhere nice and out of the way, probably up like that, or something like that. But we'll figure that out a little bit later on, exactly how we want to route that so that it's not in the way of anything. We've got to figure out how it's going to plug into all the rest of the wiring yet anyway. So now all that's left is to install our RAM in the motherboard, and then the motherboard can go into the PC. So because I bought this RAM in a kit of 4 sticks, it's not quite so important. But if you do buy your RAM separately, or you start off with 16 gig as 2 8 gig sticks and then decide you want to upgrade to 32 gig later on, the sticks are sold in what's called matched pairs, in that they come off the production line, they're tested to work together at the same clock frequency. Now, because these are 32 megahertz chips, they're actually overclocked from factory. The default clock speed for DDR RAM is actually a lot slower than these run out of the box, and you do actually need to load the XMP profile on the motherboard to even make these run at 3200 megahertz. So what we want to do is we want to make sure we install them in the correct slots in their matched pairs on the motherboard. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. So what we have here is 2 separate channels, channel 1 and channel 2. So we want to install the first matched pair in this slot and this slot, and then the second matched pair in that slot and that slot. So we don't want to go 1, 2, or 1, 2, or something like that. We want to go 1 and 2, if that makes sense. So we'll unpackage our first pair, make sure that the little catches are fully released. Lift the stick out. Now there's also a keyway here as well, so you can see there's a little notch there that corresponds with the notch there. So we want to make sure we don't try to force it in the wrong way. So it goes this way around, slots in one side, slots in the second side, push down and click into position. Second matched pair stick, same deal again. So we want to go here. So package the next one. And if all 4 sticks are installed correctly, you should see all 4 pins there are completely locked in position. And that is how we populate our motherboard. Okay, so we're now up to the stage of installing the motherboard into the case. Now, originally I thought this was gonna be really straightforward because of the nice modular design of this case, but I've come across a small, I guess, probably design feature or design oversight here, and I wanted to just quickly share it with you guys. So you have this little standoff here which needs to be installed onto the back panel of the case. It kind of goes through this little hole here on the back. It looks like that, and basically that is so that you can mount the back panel glass. So it's like a standoff or a spacer for the glass panel. Now unfortunately this screws in from the back side behind the motherboard plate. So once the motherboard's installed, you can't install this. Now, that's not really a problem per se once the motherboard's installed, but what it does mean is that if you already have it installed, you can't take this back panel off and sit it flat on a bench to install your motherboard, because obviously you're gonna have this big standoff there. And it's sort of positioned in a fashion that even if you were to sort of rotate it so it's just hanging off the table a little bit, it still makes it a lot more difficult than it needs to be. So now it's a weird design choice, because every other standoff that you see around all just sort of screws in of its own accord. So that would make it really simple, because you could just have it removed, sit the back plate on the table, install the motherboard, put it back up and then put it in, no problem at all. But because you have to screw this in from the back side, it makes it a lot more tricky than it needs to be. So just be aware of that. So I'm gonna attempt to get the motherboard installed now on my own. We may end up sort of having to support it with some bits of foam or something like that to sort of get it in position so we can get one screw in and then kind of support it and get it in that way. But just wanted to point that out to you guys. A little design quirk with this case. Okay, so truth be told, that actually wasn't as difficult as I thought it might be. Some motherboards can be really tricky to sort of get all the screws lined up and things like that. You get one in, you tighten it down, and then you can't line up the rest of them. You end up sort of having to twist and contort the board around. But all in all, that wasn't too difficult to install at all. So don't be too worried about the little standoff thing that I told you about before. Obviously, it would be easier if you could pull it out and put it together flat on the table. But it only took me a couple of minutes to get that sorted out, and I was actually able to film it without it looking too awkward and difficult. So the next thing we need to do now is get all of our various different headers installed onto the board or plugged into the board. So we're going to need to install our front bracket again and put that back up here, our I/O panel, and get that all plugged in, get our fan controller installed as well, and all our RGB hooked up. And then basically all that's left from there is to just install all of our hard lines. And yeah, we'll be ready to do a leak test and get this sucker up and running. So let's get everything plugged in now, and then we'll take a more detailed look at it all. Okay, so we're getting pretty close to the finish line now. You can see I've got most of my cable management done now as well. I didn't film doing that because it's really tedious work, but I will give you a quick look at exactly what I've done so you can see how I've laid things out and how I've concealed the majority of the wiring. I'm actually pretty happy with the way it's come up in the end. I was a little bit concerned about the back side of the case and concealing all the wiring, but it's come out pretty good. So I'll show you that quickly now. So just having a quick look at how we've laid out all of our cabling inside the case. So obviously these cables that are left over here for now are our power cables for our GPU. So we need to have 8 pins in total, 2 connectors. So those are just sort of sitting there floating for now. We've got a few cables here that we still need to tidy up and tuck away once we've finished installing everything. But you can see the majority of the cables we're able to run through the various different channels that are available around the place. So we've got our USB 3 connector there, which is always really fat and ugly and a pain to work with. We've got our USB-C here. We've got our header for our PWM signal from our pump. We've got our power switch and power LED signals here. We've got our USB connection here internally for the Corsair Link device that goes back to the power supply to control the fan and temperature monitoring, things like that for the power supply. We've got an RGB header down here, as well as our HD audio for the front panel up the top. We've got our extended ATX power up here as well for the motherboard, which we've been able to route down nicely behind here. That was the only cable that I was a little bit disappointed with, and you'll see that when we flip the case around to the back. We don't have any SATA cables whatsoever because we're running the SSD, as you saw before, behind here. We've got our ATX cable, which ran nicely. It'd be nice if they had a little cutout here so you could kind of just loop it through, but I think that's actually come out pretty nicely there. We kind of just bunched it all up together here. I might end up changing how I've laid that out a little bit, but it sort of comes in nicely behind, and you'll see that in a little bit more detail later. Now, looking down inside a little bit deeper, you can see there's quite a lot of wiring and stuff sort of tucked away. The majority of the RGB cabling and fan cabling and everything I was actually able to tuck in underneath the radiator. There's a nice little cavity there where it's nice and out of the way. So that's actually worked out pretty well. Still got a little bit of tidying up to do down here, just bunching up a few cables, but I wanted to make sure I left enough slack there that I can move things around if anything doesn't quite fit the way I need to. Also need to be able to have space to get my hands in there to start installing our piping as well. So we might end up needing to make a couple of alterations to some of the adapters and things like that that we're using. Actually had another idea to potentially spin the pump around and actually run the outlet directly into the radiator, and that reduces the need for an extra pipe there as well. But let me flip the case around quickly and I'll show you how everything's laid out on the back as well. So as I mentioned, the only cable that I wasn't super happy with was this one here that kind of stands out a little bit. Now obviously the case is going to be up against a wall, so you're never really going to see the back side of the case anyway, but I would have liked to have been able to tuck this in behind, and the only reason I couldn't do that is simply because the cable wasn't quite long enough. It needed probably about an extra 20 to 30 centimeters of length, and that way I would have been able to run it along the channel, down and underneath, and you wouldn't have been able to see it at all. But we will tidy this up a little bit later on. We might even run it through some black conduit or some loom tube or something like that to conceal it. I've actually got some nice braided tubing, so I might unplug it, run it through that so it's nice and black and more concealed. But as for the rest of the case, pretty much all of the wiring is completely concealed. We've got all the wires from our various headers on the motherboard running up and tucked in behind here, and the case does actually provide quite a convenient little channel behind here to run things behind. So we've got our PWM signal as well as our RGB signal and voltage obviously for the fans, and that's running to a Fantex PWM fan controller, which is sitting in just behind here. So that's got 6 fans running to it, 3 from the front, 3 from the top. That's also got a header which goes to the motherboard CPU fan outlet, and also a 12 volts SATA cable that also runs down to underneath here. Now I've still got to tidy up all the wiring down the bottom, so we won't worry about that too much for now. But yeah, pretty much everything else, all of our RGB cabling and everything is all tucked in underneath the radiator, so you can't see it at all. So once we've tidied up these few little bits here, used a couple more cable ties, snipped a few things off once we're happy with the layout, we should be pretty good. And obviously we'll be installing our standoffs here as well for our rear window panel too. So all in all, I got to say I'm pretty happy with how that's all come together. I thought it was going to be a lot more difficult than it was actually to conceal all the wiring, given that there's gaps everywhere and things like that, but I'm very happy with how it's come out in the end. So that is the installation of all the components onto the motherboard and the motherboard into the case, and the startings of all of our wiring and everything as well. So all that we've really got left to do now is install our 2080 Ti, which I've pulled out of my other machine now. Stayed up late last night to get that out of the other machine. The 1080 Ti is back in that rig now. We're ready to put the 2080 Ti back in. Now we did have to make a small adjustment just on the side here. I found that the graphics card with this sort of thick Aorus logo part that sort of sticks on the back here. That was hard up against the brackets here. I actually had to move the reservoir a little bit closer towards the radiator to make that fit. And that's the reason why we always want to check all of these fitments and things like that before we start making our piping and everything like that. I always leave the piping to absolute last because usually, more often than not, you have to move things around a little bit to make it all fit the way you thought it would in your head. So the next thing we're going to do now is get some of our piping done in the backside. That'll be the next video. So we're going to get the piping done in the back here, all the stuff that sort of needs to sit in behind the graphics card. Then we'll install the graphics card in our GPU riser. It's going to be mounted vertically, so it's going to sort of cover this area here all the way up to there. It's going to look really nice when it's done. Then we'll get all the rest of the piping done, do our leak testing, and hopefully, fingers crossed, everything will go well and we'll be able to fire it up and start to do some overclocking. So that is it for today's video. I hope you guys have found it interesting and useful. If you are interested in purchasing any of the gear that you've seen in today's video, you can do so using the affiliate links in the description below. Got pretty much everything that you see in this PC linked there, and a small percentage of those profits from those sales go back towards helping out the channel, which is what makes things like this possible. So if you find these videos entertaining, that is an awesome way to help out. But of course, the best way to help is always to hit the like button, make sure you're subscribed if you're not already, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next video. So we're moving on to piping next, but we also have a bunch of brand new sim gear to test out this week as well. So I'm going to put together another quick video now as a bit of a channel update, letting you know exactly what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks. We'll get this finished, of course, as well, hopefully this week, if not next. And yeah, I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.